Good evening, everybody. And on behalf of the entire team at Edelweiss Mutual Fund, I want to welcome you to another edition of Connect, Friday Connect this August. And I think we'll have what is a very, very special and meaningful conversation going into this weekend. This is the time of startups. This is the time of unicorns. This is the time of digital and technology. But when we think of homegrown startups today and technology companies, we are going to talk to one. And it's my absolute privilege to introduce Sridhar Vembosar. He doesn't need an introduction. He founded Zoho Corp in 1996, and he's been its CEO since 2000. Today, Zoho has emerged as the largest software product company in India. Providing a unique set of choices to customers, including hiring, training, product strategy, location, etc. But I think more importantly than that, Zoho, the team, and Sir himself are driven by a very unique philosophy, a very holistic philosophy that puts contentment and humility as their key virtues. So much so that when I probably mentioned that he was awarded the very prestigious Padma Shri by Government of India earlier in the year, he didn't ask me to put that in his bio. So he'd say that it's probably not needed in the world of simplicity and humility. But that tells you a lot about him. So, sir, it's our absolute pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much for sparing time to talk to our investors and advisors.
Thank you for having me, Adhika. I'm really pleasure to be here.
I want to start by asking you to tell us a little about the Zoho story. I know you started the business in the 90s, and at least the 90s for someone from India wasn't a glamorous time to build a startup. I think the environment, I'm sure, is a very different one from the one these days when startup is a buzzword. I heard the company actually started as AdventNet when it started up in 96, but where did this sort of zeal for entrepreneurship come from, and what was the early journey of Zoho from AdventNet, and then what finally became Zoho later?
Yeah. The reason for starting up then and even now, why we continue, is the same. We are a country of vast talent. Most of it is still waiting to be tapped. All these startups, all of it, we know it's useful to remember that 80-90% of our people still have not actually used e-commerce, any of these things, right? And so we know that there is a crust of India that has experienced the world, but there's vast segments of India still the talent is waiting to be discovered. And this was even more so true in the 90s when we started, and that was the reason. So we didn't think of it as a startup that was hot then. It was not, but we thought of it as a long journey of development, taking part in the development journey of our country itself. That is how I always thought about it. So 25 years later, we have come quite far as a company. We still, as a nation, we still have a long road ahead of us, and that's what we are working towards still. That's what keeps me, energized. The challenges ahead.
When you started out, and correct me if I'm wrong, the business was AdventNet. What was the first business? How did you go about acquiring customers, and how did you sort of discover the business model that became Zoho today?
Yeah. So I am not a natural born businessman, right? It wasn't like business doesn't come in the blood, so to speak. So we had to figure this out the hard way. Like we know how to write code, but how do we sell the code, right? How do we sell it? And then we used to go to trade shows, the events on at the time, physical events. I remember our very first event in Las Vegas, in Nevada, the event capital of the world, casino capital of the world, all of that. So we had like this very tiny booth, 10 by 10. And surprisingly, there were people who were interested in our software, even though we were like one of 500 or 1,000 exhibitors there. There were some people who showed interest, and they became paid customers over time. So, and we had a website, and you mentioned our website at that time was adventnet.com, and which since has been retired from service. So, and that was our website then, and we started taking, getting customers download our software and being interested in it at that time. And we made software to control or manage networks, like your LAN, corporate LANs, printers, all of those. That is what our software was. It's very humble software. We actually still have divisions that sell that kind of software globally. But if you go to manageengine.com and you'll see a lot of that, webnms.com, you'll see some of that. So that is how our roots were. And we sold primarily through those events and online too.
Yeah.
Online thing was only then taking root. So the customers will find us and then they'll call us. And I was one of the only sales people at that time. I don't know any sales, but I'm in the position of having to sell. I learned sales by selling, as you say. And that's how it happened over time. And it was helpful that, the niche we were in is obscure enough, small enough. There were not a lot of players in that. That's something that I would always recommend to other bootstrap companies. If you go into very hot segments, you're going to face a lot of VC competition, and it would be difficult to compete without the capital. But if you are in very obscure, small niches, like most companies won't be interested in, you may be able to stand your, make your own way through that.
And so how do you figure out whether a niche is, because you mentioned this, how do you figure out whether a niche is too obscure to not be meaningful enough, or whether it's interesting enough to go? How did you figure that?
That's a really good question. And we definitely have to have some local domain knowledge about that particular sector or segment and what the problems are, all of that. And you can also learn a lot by, for example, attending these events, watching what other companies do, what are their needs, all of that too. And today there's so much material online too. So for somebody starting out, there's considerable, that one thing to keep in mind is if something is too hard and already people are raising 200 million, 500 million today, it may be too hard for somebody starting out to make an impact in that particular segment. And maybe you can become a supplier to those companies, find out what those companies need rather than competing with those companies. That's how I would look at it. Somebody has raised 100 million. What does that company likely require? Maybe that's something you can supply.
So if 5 people have launched big beauty companies, figure out what you need to supply to, what the needs of those, so you can tag along with their growth.
Exactly.
So when I think of the business, when I think of Zoho, obviously my first association is of course CRM, and you compete with some of the best in the world. I mean, you have IBM, you have Salesforce, you have some of the big guys. I mean, I know when we evaluated, how does a homegrown company convince customers to pick Zoho? And it can't just be cost over some of the big guys. How do you compete with the best in the world?
Yeah. Initially, we didn't compete with any of them. We competed with really very small niche. And then as we gained strength, then we got into things like CRM. By the way, our CRM journey only began in 2003 or 4. That's when we actually started the team. We got to market around 2005. So it's actually about 9 years into the company's journey. That's when we entered the CRM market. By then, we actually had about 400, 500 people. We had revenues, we had profits. So we actually could, we had enough resources to muster an effective campaign. Our CRM took a while to become profitable. It didn't become profitable instantly. It took maybe 4 or 5 years. But one thing I knew, for example, you can even gradation of companies, right? It's easier to compete with Salesforce than compete with Microsoft. Microsoft is much more powerful in things like Office Suite than Salesforce and CRM. It's a more competitive market. So I would urge, and here is one rule of thumb I use. The market is fragmented with a lot of players. As a newcomer, you also may be able to make a mark. The market already has a monopoly and 1 or 2 players. As a newcomer, you may find it very difficult also. So, like the ubiquitous example, it's always Mumbai has so many chai wallas, but there can always be room for one more, right?
Yeah.
A tea shop, and you are going to find some business.
Yeah.
But to become the only one in something is much harder.
Hmm.
So if you're a newcomer, you should be looking out for problems where you are only one of many. The
Hmm.
rest and many small players. But once we gain enough, clout, enough resources, enough know-how, then you can compete in bigger problems. That's what we started doing.
When you see customers who evaluate or think about Zoho, what do you think? Why do you think they look at Zoho versus some of the global giants? Because for many years, I think Indian companies were always looked at, oh, okay, this is the low cost option. But you can produce world class products coming out of India.
Yeah. This is a journey. This is where my experience learning from Japan and South Korea and Taiwan, and now Chinese companies also have made the same crossover. Every one of these countries started with the image that they are low cost products, low cost companies. And then now Japan is not known for low cost. Japan is known for quality of product. Right now, actually, some Chinese companies are making the transition too. Chinese goods are becoming better in quality. That's something that we have to learn from India, absolutely, right? So that is the same kind of transformation we made over time, where we were known initially as a lower cost solution. That's the image of most Indian companies then. But over time, as we get better and better at what we do, our software has definitely gotten better. Today, with our latest, for example, in Zoho CRM, we launched Canvas by CRM and for Zoho CRM, and that is now considered one of the industry leading capabilities. No one else actually has it. So an Indian company now has an industry leading capability in our software. So that is how we have reached. So now price is not the main reason customers are choosing. They are choosing because of these capabilities. And that is how we evolve. And increasingly, over the next 5-10 years, you will see the evolution where we definitely will emerge as one of the best software companies in the world. That is the way we are heading. And I am confident that India has the talent pool to do this evolution.
Do you think there's a mindset change needed to move from being a low cost to a high quality player?
Yeah, and the mindset change is that the low cost phase is when you learn the trade, you build the capabilities. So we are very much in India, we are still in the learning phase of so many things.
Yeah.
We haven't built our first drone domestically yet. We haven't built our first MRI machine yet. We haven't built our first fighter jet yet for ourselves, right? All of these things we have to do. And those are things that unless we do it, we won't learn. But our very first efforts are not going to be the best in the world. It's not possible, right? We cannot start running in the Olympics and then immediately expect the gold. We have to build up the capability, build up the strength over time. And so that's the mindset we need, that keep the eye on the price. We want to be the best in the world, but steadily go towards that goal. That's what we have done at Zoho.
So it is a journey. And one thing I'd encourage the audience, by the way, while I have a set of questions for sir, if you do have questions, please post them and I will try to take some of them at the end of the session. So just encourage you to post them. So I wanted to come to, I can't not have a conversation with you about the current tech environment in India. And I'm sure it's extremely energizing, but how do you see the sort of recent trend of so many unicorns emerging out of India? And what do you think has changed for this ecosystem over the years for it to sort of flourish in the way that it is? I mean, 2020 and 2021 have seen probably a unicorn a week. So what do you think has changed in the ecosystem?
What changed is the massive deluge of money coming in from abroad. About 90% of venture capital in India is coming from abroad. It's not domestic sources. And this really is also the monetary forces unleashed by the Federal Reserve during the pandemic. Every major central bank did this, but the Federal Reserve is the champion of this. Simply, you just have a lot more dollars being created, and a lot of those dollars are finding their way to India. And that's, I think, the primary, if you look at the principal reason. And why India? Because we are the largest demographic in the world. That still, for example, where our GDP is $2,000 per capita, if we reach China's level, that would be 3 or 4-fold growth easily. And we could grow 10x from here. So our 3 trillion economy could become a 20, 30 trillion economy. It's possible, right? And that's what these dollars are chasing, really. The betting on the long-term growth story of India. That itself is a correct bet. The only question is, would that money have the patience to go through that growth cycle? Because some of this turns out to be, hot money, that easy come, easy go kind of money. Other countries have gone through this, flood or feast or famine situation. That is what my main concern would be. Is this money here to stay, betting on the long-term story of India, or is it will come easy go? That is the thing that needs to be seen.
And how do you make, I think the other thing that is gone, traditionally, as you said, this capital was private capital. Now, some of this capital is coming to the listed markets. We've had a couple of listings, I won't name any, and a few more coming, and not being company specific. Obviously, they trigger huge debate, even for us as public market investors. They are loss-making companies.
Yes.
What do you make of the listings coming to the public market, both for the company, for retail investors who know these brands, who are excited about these brands? So what do you make of these listings coming to the public markets?
It's what, as Warren Buffett, the leading investor in the world, would say, you only know who is swimming naked once the tide goes out, right? So you have to wait for the monetary conditions to become tighter, the liquidity to be tighter, to know which have the staying power, which don't. Just like, the venture capital flood itself. Will the flood sustain at a good pace when the monetary conditions are tighter in the US? And that may arrive sooner than we think. Right now the Federal Reserve is in a bind where the domestic inflation in the US is running very high. Tighten the money spigots there, what happens to India? Though that's the actual very important question for us. As far as the public markets, I would always say the old rules have not changed. Companies have to make money. And if you overpay for a company, it's very difficult to make a return. If you paid 100 years of earnings or 300 years of prospective earnings, it's very hard to make a return on that investment. So those are the things people will have to remember. Valuations matter. The value at which you are getting into a company absolutely matters. So those are the things people will, it's very hard to remember those things in boom times, but in bust, people are always reminded of them.
And I'm so glad this is coming from you. I wanted to ask you, you said CRM, for instance, was not a profitable product at the beginning. How did you find that trade-off between investing, growth, profitability in your own journey?
Yeah, I totally recognize that you have to invest for a while to achieve profitability in product. That's not the issue, that there is companies. But I don't know that public markets are the vehicles to fund those, eh? Two, I don't know that you can do this 10, 15, 20 years of no profits and keep on going. That's what I have issues with. And these are, I don't even know that these are best financers companies. These should be R&D divisions of already profitable companies that are financing them, right? Because I don't know that the external investor is the best place to carry that risk. And, often people are putting the retirement funds into these things. Are they well, equipped to do this? What if there is a 50% loss? Can they take it? These are the questions people should ask themselves. And the history of global, financial markets has given us ample warnings. Like there was a bust in 2001, 2. There was a major global financial crisis bust. These things recur every 10, 15 years. And so we cannot assume that markets go on a straight path up. But yet a lot of younger investors have that assumption today. That's what bothers me.
What are you, so when I spoke to Sanjeev Bikhchandani on this show probably a few months ago, he said that building a good company is the effort of a lifetime. And I don't know if you agree, but what really builds a sustainable business? What are the metrics you would use to tell that something is going to last? One of these is going to become an Infosys.
Yeah, it is. Building a company is a lifetime effort. That's totally agreed. And I've been at it 25 years. And we are still only, partway on the journey. It will be still a long road ahead for us, even at Zoho. And so he's absolutely right. But the mentality of financial markets is very short term, month to month, daily fluctuations, quarterly results, all of that. It's very easy to lose yourself in that. That's the truth. And so long-term companies, take Infosys long-term, their managements tend to stay focused, stay committed to the mission. They don't worry about those short-term fluctuations. And they insulate the employees from those short-term fluctuations. They tell people, do not worry about those fluctuations. That is the only way to build very long-term companies. That's true of Apple, under Steve Jobs, all of these companies. That's true. And that is what we have tried to do in Zoho. And we, of course, choose to stay private for that reason.
Yeah.
But even if you're a public company, you cannot be driven by day-to-day quarterly fluctuations.
I have to ask you two questions. So one, you said you chose to stay private for a reason. I would love if you could elaborate on the reason. And, if you were someone who was running a private equity fund and you had all these companies, and I'm not asking you to name companies, but what would be the metrics you would look for in companies you would invest in, as an owner of a private equity fund today?
So what I would invest in is there a deep capability they're building that is valuable in itself, that is important, and for technology, for any of them. That's an important first thing. And second, how are they going to gain customers? Is there a way in which, because the distribution problem is real, the marketing problem is real, they are up against giants, and what is their marketing? Or, a lot of companies now spend more in marketing than they take in revenue.
Yes.
And that's a serious problem. So do they have a customer acquisition strategy that is viable? Meaning they spend relatively affordable amounts to acquire customers. And so these are the questions I'll ask. Is there a moat? Warren Buffett would ask, is there something that really differentiates that company? And that could be a culture, that could be their business model, there could be their technology, whatever it is. But is there something durable there? And what is the commitment of the management, the founding team, all of that? Because a lot of times, for example, there is people are in it for 3 or 4 or 5 years and then move on. I don't see how you build great companies that way. If Steve Jobs thought that way, there is no Apple. When he came back to Apple and he stuck to it and he saw it through all the way, right? That's the only way to build great companies, in my opinion. So I would definitely evaluate it. Is the management, is the leadership here committed to this course? If they are not, if they look at this as a personal enrichment vehicle to exit, then I won't be investing in that company.
So I wanted to ask you a question about COVID and turn a little bit to COVID. And I know there are two sides in your journey to it. I think one is, what did COVID do for this sector in India, for companies like yours and for many, many others in the space? And what were your sort of personal learnings from COVID? And I know, you had put out a tweet about how, rather than spending money on marketing dollars, you can perhaps do a lot more in COVID. So I think it'd be great to know about how you saw the last 18 months of COVID for the sector, for Zoho, and for everything else that you're doing.
The first, when it arrived, we were the earliest company to lock down. We actually sent our employees, the majority of them were not from Chennai. We sent them to their hometowns. Okay, we were the first to do so, and that was in early March of 2020. And so our first goal was to ensure the safety of our own employees and the safety of their families and loved ones, communities, all of that. So we did that early on. And then, as you know, we also actually at that time, it looked like we were going to have a serious economic hit. It happened, but then the money printing started and markets started coming back. But for the first 2-3 months, it definitely was pretty dicey. And so we actually stopped our marketing activity in the time and dedicated a lot towards charitable works, including feeding and all of that. Because I would remind our employees, we get to keep 100% of our income. So many people have lost 100% of their income. So we have to help them out. That's what I used to say. And we did. And I'm proud of what we were able to do and all the time. And then by about, September, October last year, the thing had passed and pretty much life had come back to normal in most places, particularly in rural districts, all of that. And then, by January, February, our offices were operational. People were coming in, all of that. We still had an optional opening, but people were coming in. Then the second wave happened and then everything went back to the same thing. But this time there wasn't, unlike the first time, there was an anticipation that this wave will pass. And it did. Now things are pretty much back to normal in most of the places. Still there is apprehension about a third wave, all of that. But I have now come to the conclusion about COVID itself. Lockdowns are too expensive a way to fight this. We cannot lock down. Companies that can afford to work from home, employees they should do so. But the government cannot mandate everybody to sit at home, because there are people for whom staying at home means 0% of their income. And no matter what the government does, that income cannot be replaced. That work cannot be replaced. So they have to be out there. So that means that we have to appeal to the citizens to, if you are socially conscious, if you can afford to stay home, do so. But there's not a government mandate. So that's what I recommend now. And what we learned in all this journey is, first, of course, the remote work movement has taken off. In our own company, we have opened about 20 plus rural centers now. That's something that is a big change. And our rural centers are now operational. After the second wave has ended, now we are opening up all of these centers. In fact, I'm going to be visiting many of them in the next couple of months. So, and that has started. And our own employees now, there is an appreciation of, maybe everyone doesn't have to be in Chennai. We already had a Tenkasi operation. Now more and more of our employees are volunteering to work from our rural centers. So I expect in the next 5 years, 50% of our workforce might be in rural centers. Like I myself am attached to a rural center right now. So that is one thing that will happen, I believe. But overall, this has taught a lot of lessons in resilience. Like how, it's not enough just to have productivity, efficiency, but we also need resilience, which means a lot more local production, matching local demand. All of these ideas are appearing. So we came up with this idea called transnational localism, which we actually did pre-pandemic, but now that has become the governing philosophy of the company. Wherever we operate, we create capabilities there so that we create resilience. So that's how we operate now.
And what kind of capabilities are you building there?
Yeah, it is all the way from basic stuff. For example, I am right now, I am in a village, right? In a farm, we are growing almost everything to be reasonably in our kitchen. We should be using our own produce all around, and then sell the surplus to the markets, and of course feed our company, all of it. That's the goal I'm setting. For example, we're delivering milk from our own farm to our offices in Tenkasi right now. That's an example. So we have enough cows here, all of that. And this builds capabilities in our workforce here, in our rural farm. People have incomes because of that. And I'll give you an example. We were selling milk from this village at 24 rupees. Our company was purchasing at 60 rupees. I simply connected the two. I said, we'll directly sell the milk there to the company. The company will remit the 60 rupees directly to the farm here. So that way we can pay our workers better, right? Here. So that's an example, and we are making all the produce. So these are the kinds of things that we are doing to build up more resilience in the system. And that also is going to expand into maybe local manufacturing. For example, the Atmanirbhar Bharat that our Prime Minister announced, and that this Independence Day, it's absolutely vital for our country. We need to build the local capabilities in everything. And we are playing a role in that. We are actually starting to think about how to manufacture basic goods here. So those are some of the expansion plans we have right now.
It's beautiful. I want to continue on this. See, I read that you also personally moved back from the Bay Area to rural India. What was the defining reason for you to move back personally, and what have been the learnings of operating the company out of a rural center rather than sort of Silicon Valley?
Yeah, I always had affinity for rural India. This is not new, and that's from childhood fascination. So I always wanted to move back. It was a life goal for me to move back to India and rural India, particularly. I wasn't going to move to a big city. I was going to move to rural place. So, and in fact, Tenkasi, I had always wanted to live here. Even when we opened the office 10 years ago, I told our local employees then someday I hope to move here, which I eventually did. So that was the plan well before the pandemic. It was 10 years, 11 years ago. And so that is a personal dream of mine. But more from a company perspective now, particularly in this post-pandemic world, I mentioned resilience is important. Capability building is important. And the company itself was formed because there's all this talent and we ought to make more of ourselves. More of our own. We should use our own talents to be technologically much stronger as a nation. And that was actually the reason for Zoho to exist, that we felt that there's so much Indian talent that is otherwise going waste, and we must use that talent. And I still see a lot more of the talent where it comes from. All these rural areas have so many people who have undiscovered talent here. That's what our mission is, to discover as much of the talent, put them to work. That may not be just in software. It could be in other technologies. It could be in instrumentation. It could be in this. It could be building factories, all of that. That's what I want to do over the next 10, 15 years. So that is the real mission for me to move back to a village life.
You also mentioned, sir, that more employees are ready to take postings in some of your rural centers, and I guess even for us in the financial services profession, perhaps if we want to understand the heartland of Bharat, it is something we should do. But what sort of motivated them to do that, and what are the insights you think an employee gets by working out of rural India?
First, you come to a rural sectors. First, take a rural district like Tenkasi, where I am. It's about 14 lakhs people, okay? And that's the population here. The Tenkasi town itself is about 80,000 people. And if you visit the town, you'll see that the quality of life has gotten better now compared to, say, 10, 20 years ago. You actually have pretty much, you have your pizzeria, you have your ice cream parlor, you have a lot of things that you'll find in cities there, actually, in Tenkasi. So, and you have your hospital, you have many good schools around, all of that. So it's not true that the smaller towns actually have a good quality of life.
Absolutely.
And they also have a low cost of living. For example, you can rent an independent house in these parts for under 10,000 rupees, often 6,000, 7,000 rupees. 10,000 rupees actually will get you a decent house per month. So think about this from the perspective of a Mumbai or a Bangalore, places like that. I'm talking about independent houses, not an apartment, right? With room to room, with space for a garden, all of that. So this is and even move to a village, proper village, it's even lower. Probably 4,000, 5,000 rupees will get you a independent house. So this is the reality of our rural areas. And from where I'm in a remote village. It would take me about 20 minutes to reach a hospital, 20 to 25 minutes. And it's not, in Mumbai, it's probably going to be the same for you, right?
Probably longer, sir. Between the traffic.
Longer, yeah, exactly. So it's, all this. And it's about exactly 2 hours and 10 minutes to the nearest airport for me. And in Mumbai traffic, it's at least probably an hour and a half for anybody.
Oh, yes, easily.
So that's and this is a nicer drive to reach the airport from here. In Mumbai, right? So I'm just saying a lot of these things, you want the sacrifices you think people are making. That's not actually, when you get down to it, it's not true. Rest of it is in our mind, and a lot of people realize that. So our own employees, one thing is, of course, being closer to family and loved ones, their roots. That's a primary motivation. The next motivation would be cost savings. They simply can save up more and invest in, for example, their own farm or help out their relatives or loved ones, all of that. So those are all the motivations for employees to move. And if we open that option, a lot of people are taking it. A lot of people are asking for it. And increasing, actually, compared to even this time last year, a lot more people are volunteering. As some people move and report back good results, being happy, more people want to move now. I'm seeing that again. So that's, I think, I would suggest every company, your kind of work can be done from anywhere.
Absolutely.
Action. So I'll say explore small towns. For example, I was in Pune recently and I looked around the towns around, and it's a beautiful region, very beautiful region, smaller towns in Maharashtra. So those are places to explore, to put down these jobs. And it's also socially good because if we inject our income, see, I'm sure all of these jobs pay well. This income is a major boost in the local economy. In fact, we did a study around Tenkasi, and we found that the local incomes often have doubled as a result of our arrival. Real incomes have doubled. For example, your auto driver or your auto rickshaw driver will tell you, my income has doubled here because I see a lot more customers now. Because they used to be idle more, now they have more customers. And still without putting a burden of, it's not like extreme traffic here, but still this added income is a much welcome boost for locals. So we can actually do good for ourselves, our own employees, and to the surrounding community by relocating. That's what I would say.
We started the conversation with you talking about the fact that the country has so much talent. And I was reading about Zoho schools and what you're doing there. I think it'll be great if you can tell the audience what you're doing with Zoho schools to harness talent and what the mission of Zoho schools is.
Yeah. Our goal again is the same, that there's so much undiscovered talent. How do we discover it? How do we empower it? How do we nurture the talent? That has been the mission. So from the early days, we bypassed college. We didn't really believe in college because, in the workforce, people without necessarily a great academic background do really well in their jobs. We have seen this very often. And the opposite is also true. Just because somebody has an excellent academic record doesn't mean they'll make a great software engineer or a stockbroker or any of these things, right? All of this is true. Stock trading, all of these don't correlate extremely well with academic record. So you have all kinds of outliers in this. So we wanted to find our own talent. So we started, doing this experiment. This was initially an experiment about 17 years ago. And now it has blossomed into a full-fledged sort of school of learning. This year, about 200 plus kids. The pandemic has interrupted this because recruitment is very hard. The kind of students we recruit are not easily found online. We are, we kind of forget the fact majority of Indian kids don't have the option of learning online. Yeah. There's not hardly any, the internet connectivity is not there for them. The smartphones are not there. The entire household may have one phone, one smartphone. So it's not enough for everyone to do their lessons, all that. So that is the kind of kid we are after. And so we have to be physically present and recruit. That has been interrupted in the pandemic, but we have still tried to do our best in this time. But we definitely want to do a lot more of this. And we are expanding our outreach in rural centers to do this. So what we do typically is, now there's two streams here. One is the college, the high school student finished. And the second stream that we have also recently started is people who have finished some kind of college but are unemployed in rural areas. That's a lot of them too. So we take them in and put them through an incubation training, see if it can make them employable, and then provide employment. So these are the streams we have. The Zoho schools itself has about a year of rigorous hands-on curriculum, and then they go and become apprentice employees and learn on the job for another about 6 months to a year, and then they get confirmed as regular employees.
And what skills are they being trained for, sir?
Today, our Zoho schools has branches for software programming, design, marketing, and support, all of these actually. So all of these streams are being trained right now.
And all of
select based on their own interest which stream they want to pursue.
And this is all without a degree. So you could
all without a degree.
Without a degree. So that is, so you're catering to a segment of the population that doesn't have opportunities.
And actually increasingly we are also finding middle class students who afford to go to college, but for voluntarily they don't want to go to college. We are finding about 20% of the talent that's coming in are students who actually could go to college. In fact, have good, they come from CBSE school, they have a good track record, but they don't want to go to college. I mean, kids are finding us online and they're telling their parents, I want to go to this, I don't want to go to college. And sometimes it's, initially the parents react a little suspiciously or negatively. Later they learn about it, they attend one of our, webinars or something, and then they learn that maybe, this is something, my son or daughter actually may be right here. Maybe this is a good option. And that is how we find them. And also there's another draw. We actually provide a stipend. We don't charge fees. So for some students, that is also, of course, we did this for poor students who didn't afford it. But even for middle class students, the fact that, I can earn my own way and I don't have to depend on parents, that's a draw. And I always tell young people, your first responsibility is to make sure you pay your own way. I know that's not very fashionable for some, but I think responsibility comes not by indoctrination, but by actually learning to pay our own way. That is how responsibility comes.
This is beautiful. I wanted to ask you, you had tweeted about this and you said one of the sort of beautiful parts of Indian and more Eastern culture is that it grounds you in a kind of spirituality. What has your journey been like? And maybe can you explain that just a little bit for our audience?
Yeah. So there is, all this scene, if you are in our kind of secularized modern world, there's no notion of, I mean, most people, there's no notion of what is purpose in life, meaning. A lot of these questions never arise. But yet, there is also a lot of depression, a lot of that, something that's missing. A lot of people, you know this.
Of
And
course,
this expresses itself in drinking, substance abuse, a lot of that.
mental health issues.
Mental health issues, all of that. And we see this in big cities. And this is a growing problem in India. It's not just in the West, it's a growing problem in India. So one thing is obvious, and I run a company and we provide for the material advancement of people. But I'll say that materialism alone cannot save us. It's obvious. Because if I'm measuring myself by what kind of car I drive and what kind of apartment I live in, how I am ahead of the next guy, well, somebody else is going to be ahead of me. So it's going to be a constant that, treadmill, rat race. We call it the rat race. We know this.
Yeah.
So there is some point people sort of develop an aversion to these things, and then there is a void. So that's the thing Indian saints have always understood. This is one thing that our country has taught the world, and Swami Vivekananda is right by my side here, is that void, that you cannot ignore those questions, that questions inside. This is not about a particular deity, it's not about a ritual, it's not about all that. It's about those questions inside. Why am I here? What's my purpose? This is all there is going to be for life. And that is where that essence of our spirituality comes in. And I have always been aware of this at one level or the other, but as I grow older, I've become even more. I see our younger people struggling with these issues. And I see depression among, in the IT sector, it's actually rising all over. And it's an absolute problem right now. So, and I realize that we cannot, just solve it by more money. Just making more and more money is not going to solve these problems.
There's no end to it.
There's no end to it. There's no end to it. So, which means that we have to connect back. And I always now, one thing that our saints have taught us, the life of service, thinking about others, selfless service, devotion to some cause bigger than you. All of these are important. That's what I would say is the essence of Eastern spirituality. And it's also the essence of other traditions, but it's once properly understood. But it's definitely the gift of India is this understanding of the spiritual inner self, the inner journey. And I think if we forget that, we materially alone, we are not going to solve all our problems. And if you remember that, a lot of material problems are actually easier to solve. When we take that selfless service attitude, poverty is actually solvable. That's what I will say.
My last question, and then I've got a huge list of audience questions. And if anyone has any others, please do post them. My last question to you, sir, is that as someone who is so passionate about rural India, what is your vision for India and more so rural India?
Yeah, I look at my own vision is what I call a district-driven development model. This is very similar to what our President Abdul Kalam talk about. Pura, he had a vision called Pura, which is providing urban amenities in rural areas. And he wrote an entire book on this topic. He was a visionary, absolute visionary, one of the foremost visionaries India has seen. And it is that, and he was a scientist, missile scientist, and a visionary about how the economic transformation of India has to happen. And that is, my ideas are very similar in this respect, that you have to build a very strong foundation locally at the village level, smaller towns. It cannot be, the vision cannot be that we bring everybody into Mumbai and Bangalore and Chennai. I mean, it's absolutely all these cities are bursting at the seams.
Yeah.
And we cannot grow more and more and more and more. I mean, I was in Pune, and Pune is what, 8-9 million people.
Yeah.
Just to get out of the city is about an hour and a half long. From the center of the city to get out, finally, is much, more than an hour. You're just sitting in endless traffic all the time. This is not the life, I think. This could depress anyone if they are doing this every day, every single day. So that's why it is important that we avoid that type of migrate to big city in order to have a nice job kind of an attitude. And so it has to be a district-driven model. And we also have to build a lot of resilience that comes from a lot more capabilities built. And if you take 1 million people, that's a substantial people. I mentioned that Tenkasi having about 1.4 million people. There's a lot of capabilities we can build locally. And of course, we have to trade with the world, trade around India. but we also have to have a lot of domestic production.
Hmm.
And so my economic vision is there is these three things I talk about: balance, symmetry, and harmony. Balance means our trade for any large unit has to balance. What we buy and what we sell have to balance. Symmetry is our capabilities of what we demand. If we are buying smartphones, we have to be able to give back something of equal complexity.
Hmm.
In other words, we cannot just sell rice and buy smartphones. That's
Hmm.
a lack of symmetry right there. That will create a problem, because it's also, what about the kids who are scientifically or technologically oriented? Are they only supposed to grow rice, or are they supposed to migrate to places where they will talk about smartphones? So that is why we have to build those capabilities. So symmetry. And then harmony is internally, for example, between our disadvantaged communities, between men and women, there has to be much more harmony, economically, socially, all of that. So this is the balance, symmetry, harmony. That is how, and this is built on our foundation of our own spirituality,
Hmm.
that inner, that contentment, humility. For example, after all these productive forces and being efficient, all of that, if we don't have contentment, we will never be happy. We can have all the gadgets in the world, we can have all the luxuries in the world, but we have to be also be contented. Just enjoy what is. So all this is important. That is, I mean, my economic vision of what I hope to see in India.
It's beautiful. I also remember you tweeted once, and I know I'm a finance professional, and finance also represents maybe 1/3 of the market cap, that
Right.
India can't just be a company of financial services firms.
Yes, yes,
We need to
absolutely.
have ultimately manufacturing capability.
Well,
And
ultimately, finance, I mean, even the value, ultimately, somebody has to grow the food, somebody has to provide medical care, somebody has to educate the kids, somebody has to manufacture the goods, all of these. And all those people have to be treated well for them to do their jobs well. So it means that the economy has to have balance. Finance plays a crucial role of allocating capital, allocating savings, allocating flows, but that cannot be all there is to it. There has to be real stuff. It allocates the capital too. So,
absolutely. So I have got a lot of audience questions. I'll try and take a few. So I think there were a couple of people who asked, that the workplace culture at Zoho is renowned. Talk a little bit about the hiring practices, people practices, and the thought process behind this kind of culture.
yeah. A couple of rules I have for our HR. First, HR is not a marketing department. Don't go and persuade someone why they should work for you.
Mm.
Never do this hard sell on them, right? This is the kind of thing where you people have to internally have some belief in order to come to us. If you're going and constantly saying, oh, you have to join Zoho, you have to join Zoho, we are doing it wrong. So that's HR is not a marketing department. Second, I also actually, whenever we make an offer, we also tell people to think this through, why you would want to join this company. And of course, for many people that they need a job, that's a good reason. But if people have choices, I also tell them, think this through. Don't take this, just lightly. I mean, you think this through a lot. And also preferably think of it as a longer term commitment to a path. And that's also how you are going to be most effective. And the company will be better off if you are effective that way. So both will be better. And so that's why I say think of all of these. So that is how we look for people for whom our existence makes a difference. And a lot of this headhunting, all of these, you are very short-term oriented. I have an empty seat, I have to fill it. I'll go recruit somebody and place them in that seat. That's not a good approach. That's not an approach we believe in. Our approach is somebody really, have we done something to deserve their loyalty? Are we giving enough of our commitment to them? All of that. Then people will be loyal to us. That is how we look at the hiring.
I have a second set of questions that talk about the fact that ancient India in some way has been a pioneer in technology, which is more nature oriented and sustainable. And rather than building startups that are copycats of Western peers, and there has been a lot of that, how can we evolve products and technologies which are more Indian, original, sustainable?
Yeah, that's absolutely living in this village. That's a constant thought. Over time, see, we are only now, we have to, this is a famous phrase, we have to kind of decolonize our minds first. We have to think for ourselves. And there's a lot of solutions that we have. I'll give you an example of something that I found recently. take in the farming sector, you are taking from the soil, you're taking essential nutrients. For example, everything from phosphates and iron to chromium to zinc, all of the essential things our body needs. Sulfur, all of this comes out of the soil that is going into our bodies. We need those things. For example, something like phosphate. How does it get replaced? How does the soil get replenished? We think of fertilizer, right? But all of these are actually mined. They are like fossil fuel, and those mines run out. So what do, right? And if you look at the ancient Indian solution, you look at this is then where you realize there was a genius in this country. We cremate our bodies, and what do we do to the ashes? We go and actually, in a river or in a pond, we are actually dissolving that. And where does that water go? The water is going right back into the farms, right, for agriculture. Yeah. So actually the minerals are going from the ashes, going back into these things. And that is why the nutrient-rich water, right? So, and this is a religious practice, ancient religious practice in India. Yeah. I suddenly realized when I was in the farm, so this is how the whole cycle is completed. So the death is actually part of birth again now. That is what our ancients have taught us. And so we can find solutions to our problems. We just have to think holistically for ourselves. And yet I know, and sometimes we have been very fascinated with this, but today I'm actually happy to say that a lot of educated people now are rediscovering ourselves, rediscovering the real India, the inner India. That's actually been true. And in major cities, it's true now. And the popularity of yoga, all of that shows that, right? In fact, when I was a teenager, yoga was hardly known in India. But now there is an explosion of it, and all of the sustainable practices. There is a lot more awareness today, and people, even at the village level, people are aware that we shouldn't be spraying these pesticides. It's not just harming the insects; it's harming us. So all that awareness is spreading. So we have to find our own solutions, and I do believe that if we kind of decolonize the mind and end that fascination with all things Western, we will actually do that.
So there's two sets of questions, and I guess a lot of people are very curious about hiring. So one question is that for a startup founder, what is your advice in this world where people are chasing big pay packages and big brand names? And a second question on hiring is that if people were to follow your model of hiring from rural India, what would be the advice you would give companies?
I'll combine the two. For a startup founder, there's two sets of founders. One who have managed to raise lots of money. Mm-hmm. Then you are already on a kind of treadmill because your investors are going to expect a return on the investment, and you have a limited amount of time. You cannot say 25 years to return that money. You have to be, they will require this in 5 or 10 years, 8 years maybe, right? And that is in that case, your playbook is entirely different. You have no option to chase. And this is, and this is both, there have been companies that have been built that way, fast growth, but also a lot more companies trying to build that way and find a lot of those, the treadmill, the rat race issues. And this is actually a very difficult model to sustain. And in a way, it's like a steroid-driven competition. You've taken a lot of steroids and you have to run. That is the one approach. The second, you talk about rural. See, if you look at India as a, long-term story, we still have a vast amount of development to happen. If you look at our incomes, for example, I was looking at the state per capita GDPs. The southern states, typically Maharashtra, all of them, it's approximately about 2 lakh per person per year. If you look at states like Bihar and UP, it varies between about 40, 50, 60,000 rupees per year. So it's less than a third, often 1/4 of what the richer states achieve now. And there is a vast potential to lift that up. If a Bihar goes from the 40,000 or 50,000 towards the 2 lakh level, that's a quadruple of GDP. That's a vast opportunity for a lot of entrepreneurs. And then similarly in UP, and these are large, very large states, very large populations. So the dollar amounts involved in terms of how much we are going to grow is huge. It could be a 10 trillion economy, 20 trillion economy when those things happen. So that is the opportunity long term. But to realize that fundamentally requires us to build capabilities. We cannot just go in thinking that the market is going to grow. We are actually having to grow that by growing the capabilities. So I would advise startup founders to invest in people building capabilities, and don't ask people to be loyal. Instead, ask, what have I done to earn the loyalty? That is what I will advise.
That's beautiful. So don't ask if your employees are being loyal. First, ask what have you done to
Yeah,
deserve
earn that, to deserve the loyalty. Exactly.
So my last question to you, sir, is, to a 21-year-old sort of version of yourself who's just starting out their career in today's India, in today's environment, wherever it is, rural or urban, what would your advice be?
Yeah. As I said, I'd say, arm yourself with some critical capability, your skills. That's the first step. And don't assume that your education already did that for you, because often the college degree did not give you the capability. So learn something very practical. That could be programming, it could be writing, it could be anything. But be very practical, understand something very well, and be really good at it. Be really good at what we do. In other words, the first step for a very 20-year-old to do is to save themselves first. Like, put on your own oxygen mask before you assist others. So first you need to help yourself. Then only you can assist others.
Yeah.
So make sure that you have the capabilities. You are able to stand on your own 2 feet. Remember, the very, very first thing, even before anything, is, are you being supported by your parents? At 21, you shouldn't be. Are you earning your own way? Are you able to offer help to your parents, or are you taking their money? Those are the questions I'll ask. And then once you arm yourself with capability, you're supporting yourself, then see if you can help other people. That is how I'll go.
Beautiful. So first support yourself, wear your own oxygen mask,
Yes.
and go out and try to
Help others.
Lives or help others. I think that's a beautiful note to end on. I haven't had so much fun doing one of these conversations in a long time. Sridhar sir, thank you so much for taking the time. I think
Thank you for having me.
it's it's the beautiful thing about this conversation is we spoke about startups, we spoke about Silicon Valley, we spoke about rural India, we spoke about spiritualism, we spoke about everything and anything, and I think I could just keep speaking to you forever. So thank you so much on behalf of all our investors, partners, and the team at Edelweiss Mutual Fund.
My best wishes, and thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a good weekend, everyone.
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.